Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hey, it's Zoe, your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership expert and podcast host. Feels like my title is getting longer and longer each week. And my question for you this week is, how are you? How are you? We are still in the middle of this epic pandemic with no end in sight. Well, maybe there is an end in sight with all the vaccinations. In any case, it's wearing a little thin. And mental health has become more of an issue and more of a hot topic than ever. So my question for you is, how you doing with that? And it's the question I put to today's guest. His name is Mark Butler. He is a mental health strategist and clinical specialist. And he has a number of accolades to his titles. Is that even accolades to his titles? Titles to his accolades. Titles that give him accolades. In any case, it looks like a whole alphabet after his name if you go and visit him on LinkedIn. And they are, I asked him to list them out for me, Masters of Addictive Behavior, Masters of Gestalt Psychotherapy, Certified Resilience Coach, Clinical Member of PACFA, which is Psychotherapist and Counselor Federation of Australia. I think that's it. That's all his letters, but it's plenty. I really enjoy this conversation. We talk about Mark's burnout. We discuss the warning signs of burnout that we can pay attention to others and ourselves. We talk about strategies to crawl out of the hole of that and how to be preventative in terms of looking after mental health and what leaders can do to help encourage the safe conversations around mental health. Okay, let's do it. All the way from scintillating Byron Bay, welcome Mark Butler.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Delighted to be here.
Oh, it's always a delight to hear someone with a spectacular Irish accent.
Well, neither of us can be accused of having an Aussie one. My mother used to think I had an Aussie accent, but I think she was a bit deaf, I have to say.
Oh, my dad's British, and he definitely says I have an Aussie accent. I'm like, well, what the? Nobody in Australia thinks that. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly right. I've never been accused of being, or it being suggested. Are you Australian? No. It's never happened.
So, how do you go from Ireland to Byron Bay and to specializing in mental health? Like, how does that even happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it's a very long answer, so I'll try and keep it as short as I can. I came out here in 88 as a backpacker. Then I joined Virgin when Richard Branson had a film and video sort of arm out here. And then I connected and I stayed working with them for a long time. That sort of became my residency and all the rest. And I worked in the film and television industry for many, many years. And it was actually during that I experienced a level of burnout that knocked me around a little bit. And it was as a result of that I started to study mental health, partly as sort of my recovery process through a burnout episode. But also I think there was something drawing me to sort of giving back to society kind of thing. So I followed my nose with that. And I found myself doing a lot of volunteer work with people in recovery from addiction at the pointy end, the sort of 9 to 12 months recovery in a rehab facility, that sort of thing. And there wasn't a plan, there wasn't a strategy behind it, but just one day I looked up and I had 2 master's degrees and a bunch of other qualifications. And I found myself, I was developing treatment programs for veterans with post-traumatic stress who were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, who were developing substance use issues as well. And all of that was going on while I was working full-time in the film industry. So I kind of lived, I lived a double life. I was blessed that the people I worked with and worked for were very sort of forgiving, allowing me the time and space to be able to do it, as long as I kind of did my job as well. So that was my passion for a long, long time. And I've sort of I'm the spy who's come in from the cold or come out of the cold, whatever that phrase is. And I've moved away from the corporate sort of work that I've been doing in senior leadership and that sort of thing. And I'm now full-time working in this space. But instead of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, I'm trying to be the fence at the top of the cliff. So, for a long time, we've been working with people.
Excellent metaphor.
Yeah. And it's actually the last line of a poem by a guy called Joseph Malins. In 1895, he wrote a poem, and that was the last line, was better put a fence around the top of the cliff than an ambulance down in the valley. And that made me question, when did they start using ambulances? Surely not.
I know, that's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, there were ambulances in 1895? Oh my God.
The very first recording of a use of ambulances was in the Spanish Wars in the 12th century. That's where it began. But in terms of what we use now, began in the kind of the late 1800s.
Wow.
Yeah, horse-drawn ambulances. Yeah, so that surprised me as well. So it was a little bit of trivia that I found very useful, because it explained what I do, But so being in the prevention space or the early intervention space, particularly around issues like burnout and issues like mental health problems and challenges that people will experience in the workplace, that's my passion. That's where I do my best work and when I feel most alive.
Well, and you are so much in need right now, which is why I reached out to you when, my leaders are struggling. I'm struggling. Yeah. I need some expert help on this. I wouldn't mind, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all.
Could you?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your catalyzing experience where you experienced burnout yourself. What was that like?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it speaks to a couple of sort of things we'll have in our conversation, I'd say, where it'll go today. But there's a few things that came up for me. And one of the things is with burnout, you're much more likely that somebody else will recognize the symptoms in you before you'll see it in yourself. And that was my experience as well. When I was burning out, I tell a great story that I had great empathy for my team. I was running a large team at the time, and I was very empathetic and doing my best to support them through their sort of journeys and what was just a really busy, challenging time. But so much so that I didn't actually pay any attention to my own needs. So you can be empathetic and not be emotionally intelligent, if that makes sense. So to me, empathy is one part of emotional intelligence. So I recognized needs in others, but just did not see them in myself. And that manifested in, I came out of a meeting and one of our marketing directors said to me, I was just walking back to my office. And she said, look, don't worry about it. It's just film, for God's sake. Don't worry. And I said, what do you mean? And she just stopped and she looked at me and she said, you better go to the bathroom. So I said, wow, okay. I went into the bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror and I was pale and I was sweating, starting to tremble a little bit.
Wow.
And there was tears coming down my face.
And you didn't even know?
No idea. And that's actually, that's a symptom of when, okay, you probably should have acted a bit sooner. Because what it is that's your body just throwing in the towel and saying, I give up. This is just too much and it's been going on for too long. But no, it didn't tell my brain and nothing told my head that this is where I was at. I just thought I was busy. If I can just get till Friday, I'll take the weekend off. That never happened. If I can just get to month end, we have a good month, I'll be okay. If I can just get to end of quarter and deliver a good result. If we can just get to end of financial year, if I can just get to Christmas, we give ourselves all of these sorts of excuses. And it's a very common symptom. Particularly if it's your first burnout, because interestingly, people who have burned out before can recognize it creeping up and deal with it sooner a second time. So
let me just check I've got this right then. So some of the symptoms are, if I can just get to, and then I'll be okay.
Yeah.
There's that dialogue.
That's out of a sense of shame.
Shame.
Well, yeah, but I suppose, that's the phrase I would use, or it's a bit of, we're very hard on ourselves because we should be able to weather this storm. We should be strong enough. We shouldn't be succumbing to our stress levels like this. This shouldn't be happening. The self-critic in us is 10 times worse in what we'll say to ourselves than we would say to any of our team or to anybody else we're working at. So yeah, that whole idea is I'll make excuses. I should be able to do this, and if I can just do that, then all will be okay. But it's always something down the track. It's never in the here and now, yeah?
So the acute response, which sounds like, from my first aid training, sounds like shock, pale, cold, clammy, and sweating. Add tears in there. That sounds extreme. That seems to be a latent sign. What are some early signs?
That was the end of the line stuff. Yeah. I just wasn't aware of it. Look, the earlier signs, we generally find burnout is much more than just exhaustion. Yeah. And in my book, it doesn't matter what somebody calls it. Even if they're exhausted and they say, I'm burnt out, that's enough for me to say, well, we need to address it. Whatever definition you give it, or whatever definition the World Health Organization says, it's not burnout until you're experiencing three domains: one of exhaustion, one of sort of cynicism or resentment or jaded, and one of what they call efficacy, or losing your ability to do as good a job as you could do. So generally burnout has all three of those domains, and it lives on a sort of a spectrum or a continuum, if you like. And the first thing so you'll go from sort of being an engaged person in the workplace, or an employee, or team member, whatever language you want to use. And that engagement starts to slip to being sort of overwhelmed and overworked, then, all the way through disengaged and down to a level of burnout. But the symptoms that you'll start to see obviously will be tiredness, exhaustion, mentally, physically, or emotionally, or any combination of those. So that's where it kind of begins usually. But cynicism is what creeps in. And by that, as I say, when you'll hear people, even team members in your team, as an example, when they start to speak disparagingly about their leader, their teammates, the organization, maybe even your clients and customers, that's a sort of a jaded, disconnected, starting to resent what's happening for them. That's a very, very strong sign that somebody is on the road to burnout. And the interesting thing about being that sort of cynical and that jaded is we don't like to be in that place on our own. So we will quite often try to recruit somebody else into that space with us. Because when you're in that space, it's not a comfortable place to be. And it's kind of a part of starting to sort of say, I can't manage, or I can't deal with this anymore. But nobody wants to be in that awful place on their own. So they will start to try, and subconsciously try and recruit other people into sort of how bad things really are, and isn't it awful? And so you'll often hear teammates talking like that about each other, and it's usually somebody else's fault. It's never, I can't manage. It's always something else's fault. That's the difference. But when you also then throw in the idea of, even if somebody is absolutely passionate about what they do, and that actually doesn't help burnout, because it means they hang in there far longer than otherwise they might, because they don't want to let their leader down, or they don't want to let themselves down, and they tend to not take action as early as they could do because of that heightened passion. But when that happens, and we start to see their ability, or our own ability, if it's a self-reflection, if we start to see that we are not as good at our job as we used to be, we see that sort of efficacy or that ability start to slip away. So we start to miss deadlines, we start to, not meet the needs of other members in the team, etc. I spoke to somebody the other day who lost the ability to spell. They were spelling the word picnic and they typed it Picknick. For me, when I get into that sort of space of starting to be overwhelmed, I start to forget names of people. And names of people close to me, people that I was talking to last week, and what the hell is their name again? And I just can't think of it. So we get that sort of brain fog. People report that they read something, they have to read it 5 times because it's just not going in. It's just not sinking. So that ability to do the best work we can, even if that's where our heart is, we just lose that ability. We're just not firing on all cylinders anymore.
So I guess the next question is right, well, how do we avoid getting there? What are some strategies for us? These are mental health strategies.
Sure, they absolutely are. I think when I'm speaking to anybody in this space, we always need to have a conversation around self-care. And self-care is, a lot of people say, well, I'll just do one thing. I'll start exercising more. And I think when you're in a space where you're being overwhelmed physically, spiritually, emotionally, doing just one thing isn't going to cut it. So to me, self-care as a concept talks about sleep, diet, exercise, right? They're the kind of obvious ones we know of. But it also, we need to be much more rounded in our approach. And by that, I mean, we need to do more than that. People today generally are employed not so much for their brawn and their ability to lift heavy things. Most people are employed for our brains, right? And so we use our minds and we use our brains a lot, and they're very, very heavy users of energy and oxygen. And there are ways we can look after our brain because of the physical manifestations and the physical changes that occur when we are overwhelmed or when we're under stress, things that do happen in the brain. And yes, exercise produces endorphins, which is like a natural painkiller, but it also that sort of high we get from exercising. But that also creates a thing called neurogenesis, which is basically new brain cells. You know, when we're sleeping properly, we now know that the cerebral spinal fluid actually flushes our brain of toxins. So it's much more than just giving our brains a rest. There's actually a deep clean process happening when we're sleeping deeply. You know, we need to ensure that we retain or maintain connection with other people, because that strengthens different parts of the brain as well, and those relationships and connection. And that's something that we're actually starting to lose because of lockdown all of the time. We're missing out on opportunities and we're not doing it nearly as much as we should be. And we're seeing that even with children today. I mean, the number of children that are reporting to hospital with, you know, self-harming incidences, etc. And they're the ones that are only getting sort of reported, are just massively up on what they were even a year ago. So we're missing out on connection, and it's really important for a healthy sort of brain and healthy mind if we're going to be able to combat the levels of stress that we get. Diet is hugely important. You know, when I speak to leaders and I speak to teams, that we know we should be eating our fruit and veggies, you know, and our whole grains and that. So I don't talk about that. But what I talk about is why we should be. And we talk about what's now called the second brain. I don't know if you've come across this at all, but...
Oh, that's your gut, right?
Yeah, the gut biome. Because we now know the serotonin is the primary mood stabilizing hormone in the brain. And dopamine is the one that triggers sort of reward response. So in other words, doing things that are good for us, that help us as a species survive. We always thought that those chemicals were created in the brain, but we now know that 90% of our serotonin, our mood stabilizer, is created in the gut.
That's amazing.
50% of our dopamine is, and it all travels up the vagus nerve, which is, you know, runs up the spinal column, and it connects our brain with our gut, and it's the biggest actual nerve in our entire central nervous system. So I talk to people about, look, this is why you need to have a healthy diet, because if you're not creating those hormones and those mood stabilizers, if you're not creating a sufficient quantity of those for a healthy sort of brain, you're just exacerbating the levels of stress, and you're going to succumb to it far sooner.
So what do you have to eat to stimulate serotonin and dopamine production?
It's just like everything. You just got to eat a healthy diet and make sure that you've got a healthy balance in your gut, and leave your gut to do the rest of it, you know. I mean, we can talk about prebiotics and probiotics, and we can talk about eating sauerkraut and pickled vegetables and all of that sort of. All of these things aid our digestive system and aid our gut flora. But my fear is talking about anything specific that one should do above and beyond what we should normally do to eat healthy anyway, because my fear is that it'll replace something else that we should be doing.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, we all know to eat, you know, fresh vegetables, as many colors as possible, etc., etc. So, you know, so we know that. But I talk to leaders about, give them the science behind it and said, this is why you need to be eating properly. And I'll often say, you know, hands up those who forget to eat. Every hand in the room will go up. Who forgets to drink water?
Oh, yeah, easy.
Right? Every hand goes up. And we can't take those sorts of chances, not when we're under the sort of strain and duress that we're under. So sleep, diet, exercise. I talk about meditation. I talk about, maybe, you know, getting a healthy night's sleep. And we can do that. I mean, just creating a regular pattern is enough, because your body and your brain knows it needs rest and it needs sleep. So if it's given half a chance, it'll find a way. And so I use the experience of working in rehab and treatment facilities with people in long-term recovery from addiction. And if somebody who used alcohol or drugs to sleep for the last 15 years can turn their sleep habits around in less than 2 weeks and start to have a good 7 hour sleep a night, if they can do it, anybody can do it. And it's simply a question of sleep hygiene is what it's called. And it's just setting up a regular pattern and going to bed at the same time every night, and not stimulating our brains for an hour before we go to bed, just following those sorts of patterns. And even making your bed in the morning is a hugely important part of sleep hygiene.
Why?
Well, essentially, when there was Admiral, I forget his name, I think McGovern, something like that was his name. He was a US Marine, and he gave a great speech in the University of Texas a few years ago. And his speech was about, if you want to change the world, start by making your bed. And when I first heard that, I thought, okay, this is going to be, a military guy telling us to be neat and tidy and orderly. But that wasn't his point. His point was, if you start your day doing something that tells you care about yourself, first of all, and you're doing something that you can start your day in, it takes 30 seconds to a minute to make your bed. But what you're doing is you're starting your day having completed a task, right? So now I've set myself up for the rest of the day that I can do something that I've already begun my day successfully. It leads to an ongoing sort of pattern, we'll say, of self-care. And the interesting thing with that for me is when I was working with people, we'll say, in recovery, I said, first thing, yes, you're starting your day having completed a task. Secondly, you are telling yourself that you care about yourself enough that when you go to bed tonight, you're getting into a freshly made bed. Who doesn't like that? But thirdly, it's a great litmus test. You're starting to slip off the rails a little bit. It'll be one of the first things that you'll stop doing. And it's a great reminder when you go to bed tonight and your bed is unmade. You go, okay, I didn't make my bed this morning. My mind is elsewhere. I'm not sort of checking in on myself. So it can be a great sort of starter, if you like, to understanding that you might be starting to slip, which actually was one of the questions you asked me that started us on this journey was, what can people do to look after themselves? And to me, that's a really, really good one. It's a great beginning of the day, and it's a great marker just in case things are going wrong.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in red flags, like the kind of kingpin habits that if you stop doing, is going to cause a downward spiral. And that's a pretty easy one.
It's an easy one. Yeah, that and changing your clothes. You know what I mean?
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, people will wear the same, especially working from home. We're into the same pair of jammies that we were in yesterday. And well, you
change your pajamas every day?
Right? No, I'm just saying if somebody was changing or if somebody wasn't changing and they were living 3 days in the same thing, it's probably a bit of a flag.
Right. I was like, I don't wash my pajamas every day.
No, I get out of my jammies, but even if I get out of my jammies and into my tracky dacks, or as they call them, at least I'm doing something. Which actually brings up the next point, the fake commute. Have you come across this idea at all?
Yeah. Well, my business manager says that in the first lockdown, she said, yep, they get up every day. She gets everybody out of the house. They walk around the block.
Yep.
And then they come back and they start their day.
Fantastic. Because I speak to people again with the same idea. I say, hands up or wave at the camera if it's online. Who is working from home now? All of these hands go up. Who is working the time that they normally used to commute? And all of these hands will go up. And I say, okay, I'm not saying don't do it, but if I'm conservatively saying you commute for 30 minutes each way to work and home, and you're now working that, you're doing an extra hour a day, that's say 4 hours a week, right? Just to be conservative. Every 2 weeks you've worked an extra day. 26 fortnights in a year, you've effectively worked an extra month. You're working an extra month a year at that sort of pace. And I'm not saying don't do it, but what I'm saying is you need to counterbalance that with some level of self-care. And to me, the fake commute is a great one because it does two things. First of all, it stops us working far too long. Even if you spend your fake commute thinking about work, that's okay. But if you go for a 20-minute brisk walk in the morning around the block, pick up a coffee on your way back if you can, and you do that at the start and the end of the day, that's 40 minutes of exercise you've just put into your day that you probably otherwise wouldn't have done. And that can be nearly 4 kilometers. So if you can say you're walking an extra 20 kilometers a week, and you're getting 40 minutes of exercise a day that you otherwise didn't do, and you're not losing any time in doing it, the increase in your output or your performance or your productivity is phenomenal. When you do take a 20-minute break and then do some work, you'll get between 90 to 120 minutes immediately afterwards of an increased level of performance and productivity.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So, and you can do all of this stuff. This is all self-care, right? Which people often see self-care as a chore. And it can be, if that's your perspective. But it can also be, I'm taking these opportunities to do stuff I wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so we're changing it from I have to do this to I choose to do this, which shifts our perspective completely around where we're at.
I think perspective is a really important topic when it comes to this whole ideas of mental health. There's this great book by Hansi Freinacht called Nordic Politics. And it's really good. And it's talking about the future of human systems, if you like, and how the mental health crises that we are experiencing, pandemic notwithstanding, are a product of the society and systems that we've created. And there'll always be, as we evolve as a species and evolve our systems, there'll always be new problems that we need to face. And this is the symptom of the current postmodern system that we've invented. And his antidote or intervention, I suppose, to help counteract that is for organizations and governments to then invest heavily in two things: emotional intelligence and mental health. So you are completely on the cusp of what the world needs right now in terms of your space.
It truly is shifting, yeah.
The question is around perspective.
Sure.
And I know a lot of your work is about, and a lot of the conversations in the mental health area about shifting stigma, the whole idea that talking about mental health is a scary topic. Can you tell me a little bit about the perspective shift? Is it happening? And well, let's start there. Is it happening?
Why and how? Probably. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Look, if we had to find a silver lining for COVID, and I feel kind of slightly icky even saying that there is a silver lining to it, but one of the happy coincidences that has come out of it is the conversation around mental health has shifted from a nice to have to a need to have conversation. And I'm seeing that in society, I'm seeing it in organizations, which is absolutely right. That's where it should be. But we're also sort of we're seeing a divide in our community now. The vaccinated and the anti-vaxxers and the believers and the non-believers. And, we're experiencing this sort of divide that I think is, in my mind, a lot of it comes from a sort of a space of fear or a kind of a denial, which is a brain's ability. It's a brain sort of response. If an issue is that big that we don't feel like we can deal with it, we can switch into a level of denial. And I've seen that with people with addictive processes, etc. before. You get that sort of dissociated thing. And so if we don't believe it, we'll fear it. And if we fear it, we'll deny it. And if we, and we get to that sort of space that just divides people. But I think when we're wrestling with our emotions, and we do that far more than wrestling with our thoughts, because I think our thoughts come from our emotions. We talk about thinking, feeling, and doing. They're the sort of three domains, we'll say, of perspective. In my mind, it's actually feeling, thinking, doing. I think the emotion occurs first, and then we start to process that emotion and then take action on it, right? That's how I see it happening. And we do know that the frontal cortex of the brain works far, far slower than our fight or flight response, which is driven by our emotions. So in my mind, emotions have to come first. Then we try and figure out what they are, hence emotional intelligence that we talk about. But in terms of perspective, yeah, the conversation has shifted. And I think it's shifted because it had to. Because we now are recognizing issues that have been figural for people for a long, long time. But shame and stigma prevented us from having the conversation. But it's the elephant in the room can sometimes get so big that you can't ignore it anymore. To my mind, that's where it's come from. And I welcome it, I have to say. Even if we're talking about organisations, Safe Work Australia did some wonderful research. But what they came out with, what the research told them was that 8 out of 10 businesses in Australia do not have a cohesive and proactive mental health strategy for their people. So only 1 in 5 does. And many organizations think they do. And if they think they do, they think we've done enough. Okay, we can carry on now. But we need, there was an article in the Financial Review just today, and basically, the line they were using was, free yoga sessions or lunchtime meditation sessions just aren't enough anymore. And those are sort of reactive responses, and people are looking for something that's far greater than that now. Even individuals recognize that their health is far more important than sort of financial compensation or even career sort of development, etc. The most recent research puts salary at number 10 in the list of things that people desire and want in the workplace now.
What's number one?
Being valued, just having a safe environment where people feel that they can be the sort of full version of themselves. Yeah, so that's a big shift.
What is a proactive mental health strategy in a workplace? Like if there was a gold star approach, well, is there such a thing as a gold star approach? And if not, a couple of ideas would be good.
Yeah, look, yes, I think there is. I think we can be reactive to issues that occur, and therefore sort of if something comes up, we'll deal with it. The other end of that spectrum would be proactive, anticipating issues that might occur and having a strategy in place to use if it does occur. And I use the analogy of a team captain because I work with teams a lot and developing sort of the strategies for organization. But from a team perspective, the analogy I like to use is a team captain running onto the pitch with their team. The team captain, he or she really needs to know if someone in the team is starting to limp, right? Or starting to show signs that they may not be able to finish the game or they may not play their best, because that can actually affect the rest of the team and the performance of the team and even the outcome of the game. So it's not enough to sort of wait until somebody falls over and they need to be carried off, by the first aid people and taken to the physio. A captain needs to know what's going on and take the sorts of early steps necessary to intervene in that space and have a plan in place. And they usually do with substitutes on the bench. They've got a plan in place that if something does occur, we can deal with it very, very quickly and ensure that that person continues to be able to play. So keeping that sporting analogy going, we talk about pre-hab over rehab. And one of my mentors was Dan Collins for a long time, 4-time Olympic champion. And he gave me that idea of mental prehab over mental rehab. And it's in sport, an athlete will train the parts of the body that they think are most likely to succumb to an injury while they're sort of competing. So being ready for it. And I think as businesses, we can do that. We can be ready for where we think the trigger points and issues might be in terms of the mental health of our people. And a good team captain will be able to start to spot that when it's going to be an issue and take some steps to support that athlete, for want of a better term, in this analogy, support that athlete to get the help that they need in order to ensure that they are playing at their best and that the team does. We look at the All Blacks as actually any sort of national rugby team would have had the same sort of culture at one time. If you had a broken arm, you played with a broken arm, you strapped it up, but you did not surrender your jersey to somebody else, right? That was the culture. And we still have it in some industries and some businesses today, the sort of toughen up or take a teaspoon of cement kind of thing. And, but we'll get through this together. No, you need to be more proactive than that because every aspect of your business relies on it. And even more so today because we're now experiencing what they're calling the Great Resignation. And we are seeing people who are burning out, changing jobs with little sort of consideration of whether where they're moving to is going to be any better from where they're leaving. But when we've lost control and we're burning out, the desire to have some sort of control over what's happening to us will manifest itself in us finding another job and going somewhere else because in the hope that the grass will be greener. And quite often, the carrot is there's an extra 20 grand a year if you move and come join us, because there seems to be more jobs than there are people at the moment, particularly in certain industries like the tech and IT space as an example, and marketing and advertising is showing it, fintech is showing it. And people are moving they're changing jobs in the hope that where they're going is going to be better than where they are. And that's not always the case, because you're going to a job that's been vacated by somebody in that position who thought exactly what you were thinking. So now we're all playing musical chairs and nothing's actually getting fixed. But businesses are hemorrhaging their best people. So they're keeping the key people. And then when they go looking for a replacement, they're getting probably, we'll call them tier 2, because the best people have been poached. The ones on the open market are not necessarily the best for the role, but that's all we've got to choose from now.
And plus they're burnt out.
And they're burnt out anyway. So our best strategy is actually look after what we've got. Eat what's on our plate, to use that sort of an analogy.
It's just fascinating to me that this conversation on mental health is now in the public forum, because from a leadership maturity point of view, and the theme for this quarter is vertical development, which is how can we shift our perspective? How can we get to know ourselves and others and the world around us a little bit better? The whole collapse of our normal work system is needing a new perspective around mental health conversations. I even noticed this, like my husband and I are sharing an office right now because we're in lockdown. So he has a team meeting every day at 9 a.m. And this morning he's running the meeting and he says, how is everybody's mental health? And I'm like,
yeah,
where did that come from?
Yeah.
Like I've never heard them talk about it before, like
right.
They're a legal firm and they kind of have this, sometimes have a hard-nosed approach to getting down to business and carry on, but not anymore. Like, they're checking in with each other and it's really good.
Oh, thank God it's happening because, there are certain industries and look, the legal profession is one of them. Your clients, every one of your clients is highly emotionally charged. And every one of your clients wants to think that you are the most, or they are the most important to you in that sort of space. You know what I mean? And so very, very high demands. There's a huge risk of you not actually satisfying your client, if you like, and them feeling that they didn't get the best out of you that they expected, etc., etc. So, and therefore the legal profession is particularly challenged, I think, in that space. But yet, so to be having the conversation is fantastic. Brené Brown's made an absolute career, and she's a demigod in that space now. And Brené Brown took, we'll say, sort of shame and vulnerability and made them positive. She dressed it up as courage, and that actually made it okay to experience those sorts of feelings. So, nobody has done more for the world than Brené Brown in terms of actually normalizing this conversation and allowing us to be able to have it. Kristin Neff is another one around self-compassion. She's done fabulous work as well. But at least we're now able to have the conversation. And, I think for leaders especially, being able to show some sense of vulnerability or humanness, I think, is very, very important. Nobody expects their leader to be infallible and to have all the answers or not to be affected just like the rest of us. And to see the human side of our leader saying that, yeah, I'm struggling too, this is hard. Make no mistake, we're going through a really challenging time, possibly the most challenging we've had, certainly for generations. But to see the human side of our leader is the very act that will drive down stigma in the workplace and that shame and support that sort of open and trusting relationship. And that'll be sort of reciprocal, we'll say, and compassionate. And I've seen it firsthand a lot of the time working with teams, and the leader, say, is a middle manager. They're taking the spit in the face from the senior executive, but they're getting the kidney punches in the, the rabbit punches in the kidneys from their team. And they're right in the middle trying to manage and balance all of this for everybody. They're human and they're going to be struggling exactly the same as we are. But what I have seen firsthand so many times is when a leader becomes vulnerable and says, yeah, I struggle really, really hard. Just to see that shift, an instant shift in the team that rallies around their leader to say, we had no idea, we've got your back, we can all talk, we're all in this together. And they'll generate that level of sort of team level care, if you like, that supports a leader because we see the human side of them.
I have a question around that because my CEOs asked this question of me and I'm like, I want to know what the answer is from your point of view. They say, well, how much vulnerability is too much? Like, they're afraid. Like I've had at least 2 CEOs saying, I was being vulnerable with my team and I broke down and I cried. And they're worried that that's going to make it worse because they, in their mind, demonstrated loss of control. It's one thing to say, I'm struggling and this is why, and you're talking even keeled about it. And another one to say, I'm struggling, and then to burst into tears and not be in control. So they're worried about crossing that line. Is it a line that's being crossed or not?
I don't believe the line exists. That's my experience of it. And I've been in this space a long, long time. And I've seen the level of vulnerability that people show. There's the kind of relief that they experience. Now, some of them might experience, as you say, some shame around, oh God, I disclosed a bit much there. I didn't mean to go that far. But I've never seen a negative response to it. And we're social creatures, right? We're pack animals. We need to know that we belong. In fact, that would be, there's a guy, actually, Bessel van der Kolk is an expert, world-leading expert on trauma and the trauma response, etc. And he has a saying. He said that the number one, the primary requirement for us is to know that we feel that we can be safe in the company of others. So that sense of belonging. If we don't have that, we've nothing, right? And it's like, you know, if you look at a pride of lions, the baby lion in the pack, if it gets ostracized, it's dead. It doesn't survive. So we need to know that we can belong and that we're safe in a team and in a group. And, you know, Brené Brown says vulnerability is actually one of the most courageous things that we can do. So I would say to any CEO who feels like they've let the side down because they were overly vulnerable, I say, no, that's actually in your own mind. And that's probably a little sense of shame that you did maybe disclose a bit much. But the ramifications of it are not as severe as perhaps you think they are. Not anymore. Not in this life, you know. So I have never seen a negative response to somebody's vulnerability. Now, maybe I've been working in a space where it's an absolute requirement for somebody to recover and get better. I imagine there might be some people think, oh, if the competition find out that the CEO is kind of exhibiting this sort of level, that it'll upset the market in some way, shape or form. You know, maybe, but I can't see it. I don't see it. Not anymore. Not in these days.
I think the tide is shifted then, because I've actually heard a board member, this is a few years ago now, so it's not current affairs, a board member say about the CEO who had a pattern of bursting into tears.
Right.
So it wasn't just once. It seemed he was always in tears.
Right.
And the board member said, ugh, she was very dismissive. She's like, ugh, it's ridiculous. He shouldn't be bursting into tears all the time as the CEO. And she was very disparaging about it. And
tells me more about her than the CEO, to be honest. You know?
Yeah, I think that's sort of where I've come to land with that particular incident in some ways, because you don't get that kind of response anymore. I mean, this is, you know, maybe over 10 years ago now, I guess. It seems like just yesterday, but it was 10 years ago. That kind of response of the CEO must stand strong and must hold the line, all that. That's, I think you're right, is waning. The hero leadership model is definitely on the outer.
I think so. Servant leadership, leading from the back. It's like the team of Huskies kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? The leaders at the back sort of driving the thing forward. Now, of course, you could suggest that that leader, if they're that emotionally charged a lot or all of the time, they were probably in the middle of a burnout.
Yeah.
Or at the end of a burnout, actually.
Yeah.
You know, and some action needed to be taken. Yeah, there's no doubt. But for a CEO, I'm not sure if it's Ernst & Young or KPMG. They have the senior leadership have recorded, many of the senior leadership have recorded little intranet style videos of themselves talking about their levels of anxiety or their levels of depression, etc. And they're up on the internet for anyone in the organization to see. The idea being that those contact-based sort of conversations, so in other words, a conversation with somebody that you know that is real, tells us that if somebody was anxious or depressed or burned out, it's only one part of the 1,000 other parts of them, and it doesn't define them. Do you know, it's a bit like when you hear of some kind of a disaster on the news and you go, oh God, that's terrible. But if you heard it and 2 of your family friends were involved in this massive accident and they lost their lives, it means that much more, doesn't it? You know, it's not as abstract. And I think it's the same way. with leaders in organizations. Now, some people will argue with me and go, no, they've got to be seen to be sort of ramrod straight. And I said, they're not in the military. We don't, that sort of thing doesn't last anymore. And in fact, it is both the most effective way of reducing stigma in an organization and also the cheapest way of reducing stigma in an organization is to have the vulnerability of the leaders that can actually share their own journey. And particularly at the moment, when we're talking the levels of stress and angst, uncertainty, trying to keep a business alive, hemorrhaging people from our organization, any leader who pretends to stand up and say, this isn't affecting me, I call BS on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I find too is that when you actually do put a voice to, oh, I'm struggling with this, for me, when I do that, it just unplugs the charge around it. So all of a sudden I'm less stressed about it. So an example of this is like 2 weeks ago when ACT kicked in its lockdown. We were skiing. We had to come back from the snow. We had to apply to get a pass to come back. And then we're going straight into 14 days of quarantine, which means you can't leave the house.
Oh, God.
And
right.
I was pretty anxious about that. And didn't sleep well the 2 nights we had before we came back, got back. And I knew that I have some awareness. The first thing I did coming back into our house after 2 weeks away was I cleaned out the entire fridge.
Right.
Just like stripped it, washed it down, whatever, to prepare for the groceries that we had ordered in because we couldn't go to the shops. I'm like, this is not normal behavior pattern. So I'm just noticing that.
Yeah.
And then I started eating peanut butter and jam on crackers like it was going out of style. I'm like, this is not a normal behavior pattern.
It's a coping strategy. Yeah.
And then I had a bath and fell asleep in it. I'm like, wow, okay, that never happens. So I'm like, heightened levels of stress.
Yeah.
And when I spoke to one of my groups about it, I said, if you're experiencing this is what I'm experiencing. And as soon as I named it, I'm like, oh yeah, it didn't seem like as much of a big deal. It just took the energetic charge off. And I'm like, okay, so
diffusing
I'm in a stressful situation.
Yeah, absolutely. You could have done a lot worse, and people do. Yeah.
I had 4 bottles of gin and no tonic in the house, so I'm glad of that.
I thought you were going to say, and I had 4 bottles of gin.
No, I couldn't have any because I had straight gin. No, thanks.
God, no, that couldn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, we do whatever we need to do to self-care. I mean, at least we recognize it. And I think it's important to be able to know, particularly for leaders, to be able to know how to have those kind of caring conversations and know that you don't have to save the world. You're not counselors, you're not chaplains, you're not rescuers. You're just creating the space for people to go, okay, I can be all of me. I'm safe, I belong in this team, I'm valued and I matter. And I'm struggling, and it's okay. I mean, that's hugely important if you're going to maintain that level of care for your people. And for a leader to go, I don't have the answers. I can support you in whatever you think you need in order to recover or get better or get back in the saddle or, whatever terminology they want to use. But they don't actually have to save it. And there's been actually a number of sort of theories around the likelihood of somebody getting better from a mental health issue. And they all boil down to sort of 4 areas of value, if you like. And we call it the efficacy of recovery. So that, the ability to recover. And 40% of the likelihood of somebody getting better and recovering from a mental health issue is reliant on the level of support that they've got in their community. And by community, I mean family, friends, but also workplace, right? Another 30% of the likelihood of them getting better is predicated on the sense of hope that they can get better. And that 30% of hope is going to be dictated or certainly influenced by the 40% of sort of community and workplace care that they've got. So now we're 70% into the likelihood of somebody getting better. Another 15%, which takes us to 85% of the likelihood, depends on the relationship that they have with their primary carer. So in other words, their GP or their psychologist or psychiatrist or counsellor, right? And then again, the sense of hope is so the lines between these areas are quite blurred, but the likelihood of them sort of having a sense of hope that they can get better is going to be dependent in some way on the relationship they have with their caregiver. But then the treatment is used, whether it's talk therapy or whether it's medication or whether it's both or it's hypnotherapy or it's meditation or whatever it is that they use. Only 15% of the likelihood of them getting better is based on the type of treatment that they get.
Wow.
So I say to leaders, I mean, you're trying to imagine those percentages in your head now, but basically 70% of the likelihood of somebody being able to recover from an issue or a mental ill health that they've got or a mental health challenge, 70% of it can be influenced by the leader in their workplace.
Wow.
And I say to leaders, but you are not a counselor. You don't have to be a counselor. You don't have to rescue or save anyone. You're just creating a space where people feel it's safe to belong.
And you start by sharing your own story.
You can start by sharing your own story, and you can start by inquiring with them, what can we do to help?
Beautiful.
Right? And 70% of the likelihood of them getting better is based on that. And if you try to become the rescuer, or you try to become the clinician, or here's what you do, or have you thought about not being anxious or change your, that sort of stuff, that just grates on people.
Just pull up your socks.
Yeah. I remember being really ill one time. I had just one infection after another, chest and sinus, but I had glandular fever that I didn't know at the time. And all I can remember is people telling me to take vitamin C and garlic, and I'm on my 5th course of antibiotics. It's honestly, vitamin C and garlic's just not going to cut it. But this was, well-meaning advice that was of absolutely no value to me. And it's the same thing for leaders of teams. You don't have to have the answers. Nobody expects you to have them. But if you create a space where it's okay to not be okay, job done. That's as much as anyone can ask of you. And it's more than they've already got, because now they know they belong and they're safe. Job done.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful way to finish the interview. This has just been delightful.
I've loved it. Thank you.
I'm glad you've loved it. I've loved it too, and I've learned a lot.
Oh, I'm glad of that as well.
So thanks so much. Before we sign off, where can people find out more about your work? Because I know you've got a number of white papers. I saw that on your LinkedIn profile. Where's the best place to send people?
Probably LinkedIn is a great place to start. And you'll find me, I'm very easily found there on LinkedIn, just under Mark Butler. My website is up on blocks at the moment, but it's going to be finished fairly soon. You got to rejuvenate these quite often. But it's markbutler.com.au, or send me an email, mark@markbutler.com.au. I'll always have a conversation with anybody, particularly if it's somebody that's reaching out looking for some help or some advice or guidance or support, or just to be told it's okay to not be okay. Reach out. Absolutely. I'm very happy to help.
Thank you, Mark. That's terrific.
Thank you, Zoe.
I took so much out of that interview with Mark, or that conversation, I should say, with Mark. One of the things that's sticking with me a little bit, and it's because it challenges one of the models I developed for my very first book, Composure, and that's the idea that thoughts trigger feelings. And he suggests that feelings actually come before thoughts, because emotions are really subconscious triggers. And it's our brains that then try and explain what they are. And I think he's right. I think I have to change my model. I think in reality, sometimes the two flow between each other. So our emotions are always a indicator system of what's happening from our subconscious. I agree with that. And sometimes we let our brains get away with themselves, and that causes some of the emotional distress. So I'll say, yeah, it's a little bit of both with that. So that's one aspect of it. But another aspect, it was the incredible statistics he shared towards the end, around 70% of the chance of recovery from a mental health challenge or burnout challenge is knowing that we've got enough support around us, that we belong and that somebody cares. And as leaders, it's our job not to fix people, but to provide a place where they know that it's okay to say, I'm not doing that well, and that's okay. Just by doing that, by role modeling that, we're increasing the likelihood of people being able to come through it by such a huge amount. Well, to me, that's amazing. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I found it quite powerful and useful and apropos, given the times and surroundings. The other thing I have to announce is that we have a new sponsor. Da, 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 da. I never intended to get a sponsor for the show. Interplicity reached out to me and suggested that, or asked if they could become a sponsor for the show. And I did a bit of a deep dive around their work, and I'm thrilled to announce that they are our new sponsor. They offer professional online courses in leadership development. And we'll be having a number of guests coming up who are faculty at Interplicity. So you get to know them a little bit that way too. But in the meantime, I'm so excited to announce them as our sponsor for the show. And there'll be a little bit more detail about how you can save $100 off any of their courses coming up soon. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.